Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Scrapperlock Rants with Power Wash Simulator. We are continuing our job here in the subway, so this side of the tracks you can see is nice and clean. Everything is pretty much done here. And then we have the middle, and then we have this side of the track, which is identical to that side. I'm going to do a bunch of stuff on the ceiling as well. So I'm going to take this ladder and just sort of move it where I don't need it just to get it out of the way. And today we're going to work on the middle here, and we are going to continue ranting. I don't always have a lot of stuff to rant about, so sometimes I go a long time without ranting. But something came up yesterday that I think is worth talking about, so let's go ahead and discuss it. I don't know how much of this is going to be a rant so much as just a discussion on role playing game philosophy and just how things work in role playing games. I feel like sometimes even people who should know better don't seem to really know how it works when you play a role playing game. So, sometime in the last day or two, as of this recording, which will probably be about a week or two ago to you when you watch it, the person, I can't remember his name now, you'll have to forgive me and you can look this up. The person who wrote a book on the history of Dungeons and Dragons and is supposedly a role playing game historian. I say supposedly because I definitely think this person doesn't really get it, and you'll see that as we go. He wrote supposedly an open letter to Wizards of the Coast telling them how to make Dungeons and Dragons a billion-dollar business, right? This is probably based on the fact that it's leaked out. I don't know if it was supposed to be a secret, but it's sort of leaked out and has become known in the gaming world that Dungeons and Dragons makes, I don't know, a couple hundred million a year, and that Wizards of the Coast, makes a certain amount of money, but they've been charged by Hasbro with like doubling their revenue, and I guess their long-term plan is to make Dungeons and Dragons a billion-dollar concern, right? And so he's like, here's how you do it. And he tells them they're doing it wrong, which I agree with. And then he tells them how to do it correctly. And I think that his idea is like beyond pie in the sky. It can't work. And I'm going to explain why it can't work. That doesn't mean I don't think that there's any way to make D&D a billion-dollar company, but I don't think the way Wizards is doing it works. I think he's right about that, but his way won't work either. And so we're going to talk about kind of why that is. And as we go, we'll clean up this floor in here. I like going in nice straight lines. Yeah, let's go ahead all the way to this edge, and we'll do this too. So first of all, he talks about what he thinks are the mistakes that Wizards of the Coast is making, are what the mistakes they're making, and I agree with him about the mistakes. I agree with this. So he talks about how one of the things that Wizards of the Coast is doing is targeting players. We've talked about this before. They're targeting players rather than game masters, right? They are trying to get players to buy all the books. So they'll put out a book, and again, I've mentioned this before, they'll put out a book like Strixhaven or Wild Beyond the Witchlight, which are supposed to be source books for settings that DMs can use to run games. Right? So these are for game masters. But they then put into these setting books, which are supposed to be for game masters, custom, new, cool, better than you can find in any other book, races and subclasses, because they know players want to get more powerful characters and they want to have more powerful options and more options. And so they know that the players, and I apologize if you can hear the people are trimming my hedges and stuff outside. I apologize. It should be over in a minute. They know that the players want these options, and so they can get the players to buy the books if they put spells and feats and subclasses and races into the book. And so they put in spells that are overpowered or more powerful compared to the existing spells in Player's Handbook, because then the players will want them, right? Oh, let's buy this book so we can have silvery barbs, or whatever the spell is, right? And so what they're trying to do, right, is get everyone to buy every book. And he argues that this strategy is doomed. And the reason it's doomed is that in order to get everyone to buy every book, they have to kind of make it generic and not exactly what the dungeon master needs, right? Also, he doesn't say this, but I'll say it, by adding all these up-powered options, they make running the game harder for the dungeon master, right? The game master has a harder time because you have all of these upscaled options for your player character. And so if you use those player characters with the old content and not the new content, the old content isn't scaled right for it, right? A number of people, Luke Hart included, have said, like, you have to be very careful using older adventures. If you want to use Horde of the Dragon Queen and Rise of Tiamat, right? Those are the first two adventures published. Apparently, they're not that great. Most people don't play them anymore. But if you and your group wanted to play them, you would have to seriously buff the encounters, because the encounters presuppose Player's Handbook only races and classes and feats, and the monsters are not balanced against the newer stuff that's all a lot more powerful than the old stuff. And so this makes the GM's life harder, although the author of this letter did not point to that, right? He simply said that this isn't what the GM needs, right? Now, the reason Wizards of the Coast is trying to market all their books to all the players is that they publicly have stated that they believe that only 20% of their audience is DMs. I don't know if they really think that, but they're way off. Only about 1 in 30 people, as the numbers I've seen indicate from like real surveys and stuff, indicate that only about 1 in 30 people who want to play D&D are game masters. Now, I think a lot of people who claim to be D&D players don't really play very often, if at all, right? But in terms of people who are interested in Dungeons and Dragons, only about 1 in 30 of them are dungeon masters. And even if Hasbro's right and it's 1 in 5, or let's compromise and call it 1 in 10, right? They feel like they can't put out a book that's only going to appeal to 1/10 or 1/5 or worse, 1/30th of their audience, right? That's not a good business strategy, because you're not selling to everyone, right? And so they're trying to sell to 100% of their audience, and in order to do that, they want the books to appeal to everyone. But what he argues is that this ends up making the books appeal to no one, and I think he's right, and that that's not the right strategy. And he points out that in order to have a D&D game, you need dungeon masters. You need game masters to have any role-playing game. And he correctly has noticed that what Wizards of the Coast is trying to do about this is to turn D&D into a video game, right? And he says that's not the right strategy either, because it's not a video game. And so making the VTT like a video game and then, having it be an automated DM, that's not going to work. And I agree with him about that. That is what they're trying to do, and it's not going to work, right? He doesn't really get into the weeds of the argument about the VTT. He just says that's not a viable strategy. And I agree with him. It's not. So what does he say is the viable strategy, and will it work? So what he argues is that what Wizards of the Coast, I keep almost saying TSR, what Wizards of the Coast needs to do is make sure that there are enough dungeon masters, that you can only have one game running per DM, basically, right? There are a few people who run multiple games, but it's really rare. So you can have only one game per DM, right? For every 4 or 5 people in a group, you need a DM. And right now, because their numbers are not correct, and they don't have 1/5 of the population of players being DMs, there isn't a DM for every group of 5 or 6 people. There are many groups that don't have DMs, as the fact that there is paid DMing clearly demonstrates, right? If there were enough DMs for every group of 5 or 6 people who want to play D&D, there wouldn't be such a thing as paid DMing because there wouldn't be any demand for it, right? So the fact that people are willing to pay to play D&D and play it with strangers, right? That's not the desired way to play for most people. Most people want to play D&D with their friends. But either their friends don't want to play with them, or none of their people in their group want to or has time to be a game master, right? Game mastering takes time. Look at my group. I'm the only one. The reason we're playing Deadlands right now and not D&D 5th edition, even though I think most of my players would rather play D&D if given their druthers, okay? The reason we're playing Deadlands is because I'm the only one willing to GM and I offered to run that, right? My best friend's supposed to be DMing a D&D game, but he was supposed to start in January. It's now April, and I don't think he's even begun to plan it. He's too busy with his real life. One of the other players, the girl in Finland, loves to DM. She told me her favorite thing to do is to DM, not play. But she said she only wants to DM in person. She doesn't feel like she would enjoy using the VTT. She wants to use pencil and paper. And she's really not interested in doing it online. And she wants to do it for a smaller group in person and with her husband. Like, her husband is kind of jealous that she gets to play D&D and he doesn't. And she wants to run for him because it's been a long time since she's been able to run a game for her husband, since they have a kid and everything. And so what she wants to do is get a group together in Finland and run for them. Not that she wouldn't run for us if we were there in person, but that's not how she feels comfortable playing D&D. So we have one person who doesn't want to run online, one person who's too busy with work. The other guy has a kid and he's too busy with his kid, and the other girl is too new to the game, and she said she feels like D&D is super complicated, and if she ran a game, she might prefer to run Savage Worlds. So there's nobody else to do it in my group, even though we all are friends and we all want to play together and we all want to play D&D or some role-playing game. There's only one person who actually is in a position to run the game, right? And hopefully nothing will come of it, but I, had a little bit of an issue with a blood test recently, and I've got to go to the doctor and see what that's about. And if it turns out that I'm into it for something, hopefully it's nothing serious. I feel fine. But if it turns out that I'm into it for some kind of procedure and I'm going to be laid up for a while, I might not be able to run either. Right now, temporarily, somebody else in my group might be able to take over till I, get better or whatever. If it turns out that this turns into anything, hopefully it won't. But my point is, like, you can have a whole group of people and just nobody's physically or temporally, time-wise, able to run. Right? So there's a shortage of DMs. And what his argument was is because there's a shortage of DMs, then you kind of have a shortage of everything, right? Because if people want to play and they can't, well, they're not going to buy books. Right? I mean, some people will. He said, some people are just always going to buy books. Sure. But there are lots of people who are going to say, well, there's no point to me buying Deadlands books because nobody wants to play Deadlands with me. There's no point to me buying D&D books because there's nobody to play, right? There isn't a DM, so why should I buy the player materials, right? That's definitely likely to happen. So what he argues is that what Hasbro needs to do, and by the way, I want to show this is so cool. I love this. So we watch this thing and you look behind it and you can kind of see the shape of the light in the shadow behind it. It didn't come out as clear as it did on the other side, and I didn't show that, but it's kind of cool. I really like the way this game is designed. It's a lot of fun and very relaxing at the same time, at least most of the time. So what he argues is, if Hasbro wants to make D&D a billion-dollar company, what they have to do is support DMs. If you support DMs and make their jobs easier, there will be more DMs, right? DMing is perceived as being hard and thankless and difficult. And so what they have to do is make the DM's job easier. And if you make the DM's job easier, there will be more DMs. There will be more people who want to DM. Now, ironically and interestingly enough, the Basic Expert actually made this same statement. He talked about, and I think Questing Beast also, Questing Beast said as well, like if you talk to old school players, most old school players also run games, but most 5th edition players don't. And he believed this because it's just easier to run an old school game because all you have to do is have a dungeon and people go explore it, right? You don't need to make up narrative and story and everything. You just do some West Marches stuff and it's much easier to run, right? It's much less effort on the DM's part. And you can go back and look at my Dungeon 23 that I was doing, right? And I did stop doing that because now I'm running Deadlands. But that was like create a room a day, right? And all I had to do, all I was doing, right? Now you don't have to do it this way, but I was able to randomly roll up what the room shape and size was, where the corridors went, and until I got to a room, right? You randomly generate corridors until you come up with a room, and then I was just generating the content of the room, right? And I was doing it based on themes and stuff. You don't have to do that, but I remember I was telling our newest player, right, that that's a lot less effort, and I could run essentially indefinitely doing a mega dungeon like that, right? Because if you do one a day, one room a day, it takes like maybe 20 minutes a day, maybe a half hour, something like that. At the end of the week, you have 7 rooms, and no party, if you're playing a session a week, no party is going to get through 7 rooms in a week, right? Maybe they could, but you can easily stay ahead of them that way, right? And so that's a much easier way to run. And so his point, I think, is well taken that there will be more GMs if you make running the game easier. I think that's true. However, I don't think there's any way that just making it easier to GM is going to make Hasbro that much more money. And I want to talk about why that is. But first, I want to talk about the things he said would help GMs. Because I think he's right. One of the things he said is you need to make real setting books that are designed as a setting, not as a way to attract players to buy the book. So that's one thing. And I think that's true, right? Because a real setting book would have the information in it the GM needs, but also would have information in it that the players don't have and don't know, which would make it cool for them to explore the setting, right? I mean, I'm frustrated with this even with Pinnacle, and I love Pinnacle as a company. You guys know I love them, but they used to make player books and GM books for their settings. They do it in ETU. They used to do it with Deadlands, like in Savage Worlds Deluxe. And in the new version with Suede, they've started with all their books, I think. Certainly Deadlands The Weird West, and certainly with Holler, they're making a single book that has both the GM and the player stuff in it. And I know why they're doing it. If it's a thicker book, they can charge more money, and then both the players and the GMs will buy it. And it's the same thing Wizards of the Coast is doing. But the problem with that is then as a GM, you have to rely on the willpower of your players not to flip into the back of the book and read the adventures. There's a whole campaign in Holler. The entire campaign, plot point campaign, is not in a separate book. It's in the back of the Holler book. Well, not every player has the willpower not to look at that. You can have the willpower not to buy it. You just don't order it from the website, right? If it's a setting book. But if the stuff is in there and you're going to run the adventure that's in the book that the players have, yeah, it takes a lot of willpower not to look at that stuff. So I would argue that that's one of the things that they could do better with these campaign books. Any company is to have GM-only stuff that the players don't have to exert a supreme act of will not to look at. But again, so this is what he's saying. Yeah, it makes you more money because you sell that book to everybody. But if you don't make the GM's job easier, you won't sell as many copies of the book, period, because there isn't anybody to run the game, right? And I think that that's a good point. So he argues you should make the GM's job easier. He points out that a lot of their adventures are written by like a dozen people, and that's why they're kind of a mess. He said just have 1 to 3 authors max for an entire campaign. And he said you got to revamp the way you present these to use what some of the other companies are doing in terms of how they present the information. Luke Hart always talks about how when they do his products for the DM layer, they try to make sure that they have bulleted lists and they put all the information up front that the GM needs to know, so it's sitting right there, and they boldface the key terms. And Wizards of the Coast just doesn't really do that, right? They've always, I mean, even going back to the original TSR days, they write the module like a narrative, like a book. And then you have to go through as a GM and make your own notes and run the module from your notes, not from the text, because it would take you forever to read the text. You can't read the text at the table, right? And I had to do this actually with Coffin Rock, which is written an awful lot like an old school module. It's not like a more modern Suede plot point campaign, because it's not a campaign, it's just an adventure. But I had to go through, and for every section, every building that's numbered on the map, I had to make a bulleted outline of the key points, because I can't sit there and read 3 paragraphs of text when the players walk into a room. I've got to know what's in there. And I can't just memorize it all. There's 20 different rooms. There's dozens of NPCs. So I had to make like bulleted outlines of this stuff. And so, one of the things he's arguing is you got to reformat your campaign books and your adventure books to be more easily readable by the GM. And so these are definitely good ideas. He did talk about having smaller, more module adventures, box sets with handouts for the players and maps and battle maps and everything, so that the GM doesn't have to come up with all that himself. And all of those things do make your job easier as a game master. It's one of the reasons why I like the really high end adventures from Call of Cthulhu, like the Mass or Nyarlathotep, which is quite expensive, but it's a whole box of player handouts and stuff, which is really cool. And then I don't have to generate that stuff if I'm playing at the table. And he said, make PDFs available, right? This is something Wizards has not done. Make PDFs available to the players, so that to the GM, so that they can just print and hand the stuff out if they need to, or do it on a VTT if they're not playing in person, right? And so I think all of those do make the GM's job easier. But his premise is that doing this will increase the number of GMs. That what he argues is, if you started with 10 GMs, and there were only 10 people in the world who DM D&D, and if each one of them taught one other person to play D&D each year, in 20 years there'd be 20 million game masters out there. And you could then support a player base, he didn't say this, but I will, have about 100 million people, because each GM can run for 4 or 5 people, right? And then if each person just spends $10 a year, you're a $1 billion company. And the math is probably correct, but I don't think it would work. So let me explain now why I don't think it would work. And why I think that inevitably there is an upper limit to how many games can be run, because I think there's an upper limit to how many game masters there can be. And this actually goes back to I think it was one of the Quintessence last videos, where I was talking about Trevor Duvall and how he had done he in, I don't know, it was one of his live streams or something. He had talked about how game mastering is a skill and anyone can learn it. And I disagreed with him. I don't disagree that it's a skill. And I don't disagree that anyone can learn the mechanical skills of game mastering. That is, how to use the GM screen, how to read and interpret the rules, how to make rulings at the table, how to design adventures. Like, yes, there are tons of resources for you on the internet to teach you how to do this, and anyone can mechanically learn how to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean that anyone could be a good GM, because there's also a personality type. Game masters have to have a certain temperament, and this is what I said in the video where we talked about Trevor's comment. There's a temperament to being a GM, and I brought up when we were kids, my best friend has the temperament. He was a great dungeon master and GM in Champions. He was fantastic, great in D&D, great in Champions. The best GM, the good Rob as I call him, he was amazing. He had the temperament to be an incredible GM. He did it so well, and most of my GMing style comes from basically copying his GMing style because it was so good and putting my own spin on it, right? I think I have the temperament to be a game master, but there are other people who do not. And the bad Rob, who I've mentioned in some of my rants, he had. I guess I said this in the video where I was talking about Trevor Duvall. He had all the requisite skills. He knew the rules of champions. He knew how to run combat. He knew how to build a scenario. He knew how to make up villains. But he was a terrible game master, and the reason was that he was selfish. And selfishness does not lend itself to good game mastering. He cared about his own characters, and he made them the star of the show. And that's not what good game masters do, because it's a selfish thing to do. You have to have the right temperament to be a good game master. Look how nice and clean this looks now. Huh, guys? You have to have the right temperament to be a good game master, and the bad Rob didn't have it. And no matter how much help Wizards of the Coast gives, this is my point. No matter how many people existing DMs are willing to teach how to DM, right? They can't cause people who don't have the temperament to be a game master to be one. And it's actually my experience that it's a bad idea to have people who don't have the right temperament, don't have that sort of attitude of being here for the group and the table rather than for yourself. It's a bad idea to have people who don't have the right temperament try to run a D&D game. You're not going to have fun in the game, right? I literally don't remember a single session with the bad Rob that was any fun. He ruined every session of Champions that he ran because he was a bad GM. Not because he didn't have the skills, but because he didn't have the temperament, right? He was in it for himself and his own characters and his own self-aggrandizement. Because of that, he didn't put the work into it that the rest of us did. There was another game master who was mediocre. Another friend of mine. This is the one who ran a short, like 8-week or so campaign to give me a break in the middle of my 2-year campaign over the summer. He ran. He said, "I want to run before I go to college." He was graduated high school. He said, "Before I go off to school and don't play Champions anymore, I'd like to run." Right? And I know he thought he could do it better than I could. And after 8 weeks, he said, and I've told this story, like I went on vacation with my family. We used to go to Florida every year to visit my relatives. And that's one of the reasons I said you should run, because then he could run Champions for those guys while I was out of town. And I brought all my Champions stuff with me. I brought my Champions box and I was working on villains, and I was writing up stuff for when I was going to take back over. We were doing sort of a crossover. And I came back. They were playing that night. I went over their house the night we came back. My mother thought I was crazy. We had just come back on a flight, and we walked in the door, and the phone was ringing, and my mother was like, "Oh my gosh, who is this calling us? We just got home." and I do apologize for clearing my voice so much. I have a morning voice. And I picked it up, and it was him. And he was like, "We just called you to see if you're there. If you're not, you don't have to come. But we're playing tonight." I'm like, "Okay, I'll come over." It was like 6 o'clock. They're gonna play at 8. Yeah, I can be there. And there was a joke. My best friend, who's always late, he was late. I got there. A little late. I got there at like 8:15, just because I had to unpack and stuff. He got there even later, and we joked that like we were in New Jersey, and we joked I got to my friend's house faster from Florida than he got from the next town over. And he just laughed, of course, because he was always late. And we knew he was going to be, because he was always late in those days. He's not like that anymore. So the next morning we went to play tennis. This one guy and I, nobody else could do it, and he and I were going to play one-on-one tennis. So he used to play doubles most of the time because we were lazy. But when nobody else could make it, he and I would play. So he picks me up. I get in the car, and he said, and I had been in the session the night before, and we were in the middle of whatever the story was, and he said, um, "The next session tomorrow night is going to be the last one. I hope you're ready." And I was like, "Well, I'm ready, but really, you're going to end it?" He said, "I'm going to make sure it ends." And then he said to me, "I don't know how you can stand it." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "GMing for these guys. Like, I don't know how you can take it. I want to kill them. I want to kill them all." He couldn't take it anymore. Like, I don't know if they were questioning his rulings or what while I was away, but he's like, I want to kill each and every one of them. I don't want to DM ever again, or GM ever again. He said, I don't know how you've been able to put up with us, including me, for a year, because I would have quit 9 months ago. And I was like, well, okay. I was having fun. Like, I don't mind. He said, well, I don't know how you don't mind because I can't take these guys. I can't take it. You have to take back over, right? He was just so frustrated. I don't know. And I honestly, I don't know what they were doing because I'd been away for 2 weeks and I don't know what. So I don't know what kind of shenanigans they got up to. I have no idea what they were doing to him, right? But he did not put the effort into the game that I did, and it was very clear to everyone that he didn't. He made very quick, sketchy maps or did theater of the mind, whereas I would create all of these very detailed battle maps. And look, you don't have to have detailed battle maps. Theater of the mind is fine, and every GM has their own style. And I think one of the things that was a problem for him is that several of the players had only ever played under my style. The rest of us had played with the good GM and my best friend, and my style was sort of an amalgam of theirs, right? So nobody had ever really played with a different style from the kind of amalgamated style that we all kind of did with each other. And he had a very different style, and I guess people just weren't used to that, and maybe they didn't like it on that basis. I don't really know, um, but anyway, he struggled to run that game, and it was mediocre, I would say, right? I didn't not have fun, but it wasn't great. And after that experience, he was not interested in running, and I'm not sure any of the rest of us would have been interested in being in a game he ran, right? And my point is that that's because not everybody really has the temperament. He what he was saying to me when he was like, I can't take it anymore, is I don't have the temperament to run for these guys. I can't run this game for them, right? The things that they were doing to me that didn't bother me were driving him nuts. And it was just player crap. Right? It's the same kind of player crap that players always do and that he did to me. But he couldn't take it as a GM. And this is my point. Not everybody is cut out for GMing. Not everyone wants to do it. And even if they want to do it, like he did, not everyone is cut out for it. And so we have two people. One guy who said, I give up. I don't want to do this anymore. And another guy who was a bad GM, and none of us liked his games. They were terrible. And so my point is that not everyone is going to be good at this. And so it's not just a matter of making it easier and teaching people the skills of GMing. They've got to have the temperament, guys. They've got to have the right temperament. If they don't, then they're not going to provide a good experience to people. If they provide an experience at all, because then the other thing that starts happening is they don't prep. Right? They don't do the prep work. They don't take the time to create the NPCs and everything, right? And because they're not dedicated, they're not enjoying being the GM, and so when you don't enjoy it, you don't do the work, right? Remember the argument about fun and how you can't make people have fun your way. Well, you can't make somebody have fun being a GM. They either do or they don't, right? I mean, Colville's whole running the game videos, his whole set of videos, there's like 150 of them or something now, over 100. And what does he say in his opening monologue? He's talking about being a GM, and he says, my goal is to show you that it's actually not that hard, and it's fun, right? It's actually not that hard to be a GM, and it's fun. I think he believes that because he has the GM's temperament, right? If you don't have the temperament, like my friend Dave clearly did not, and this is what he was telling me, I don't have the temperament for this. Being a GM can be brutally hard, and um, a lot of people would not be willing to do it, right? Um, if you go back to the video about the questing beast and where he was talking about the article on all the shortage of GMs in New York, and it was talking about how it's a thankless job and all the sort of quote unquote negatives about being a game master. Well, that was written by and about people who don't have the temperament to be a GM. Right? If you have the temperament and you love doing it, you're no GM. Matt Colville would never say it's a thankless job because he's got the temperament and he loves doing it. Matt Mercer would never say it's a thankless job because he's got the temperament and he loves doing it. Why hasn't anyone come forward long term, not just for a few weeks, but long term in Mercer's group to perma GM for like a couple of years to give him a break? Why? Because Mercer loves doing it. He's got the GM temperament. They all know it, and probably the rest of them don't. And I'm not saying anything bad about the rest of the players. What I'm saying is some people just really love doing it because they've got the right temperament. When my group was done with Rome, actually, before they were done with Rome, after I'd said I'm going to stop running Rome. Now I stopped running Rome because I had a lot of issues with D&D, and I felt like I painted myself into the corner with that campaign, and it had gone on long enough, and so on. There were a lot of reasons, and I've talked about them here. But as they were finishing, as we were wrapping up, I started working on a map of Harn land, right, of Harn, and coming up with a bunch of house rules that I would use if I played Savage Worlds in the Harn world, right, and starting to prepare for what my next session 0 was going to be like, and so on. I was starting to prep the possibility of another campaign. And one of the players actually found this quite humorous. And because I posted, here's the map I'm working on of this world. And he wrote in the Discord, Scrapperlock, not that, my real name, Scrapperlock, I'm burned out and need to stop GMing. Also, Scrapperlock, here's a cool new world I want to GM in. Yup. Why? Because I'm trying to get on top of this thing, but it doesn't want to let me. Why? Because I have the GM mindset and I like to do it. Right? I enjoy it. And therefore, it's not like the hard work isn't hard for me. It's fun for me. So, no matter how easy they make D&D to learn and run, they can't make people have that mindset. You can't do it. And because you can't make people have that mindset, you can't really necessarily make a bunch of new good DMs that people want to play with. You may not be able to make DMs at all. Right? Some like this guy who GM'd a little bit and was like, you got to take back over, I can't take it anymore. There's no amount of easier work you could give him at that point that would have made him want to keep running Champions because he was frustrated by the player behaviors. The same player behaviors that every GM has to deal with, or I would maybe even say gets to deal with, because it has to makes it sound too negative. The same player behaviors that every GM deals with in every campaign, in every game, regardless of game system, and has since role-playing games were first invented and Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax were doing it, right? The same stuff that Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax were dealing with in their games for, 20 years made this one guy want to quit after 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, right? Same stuff that I had been dealing with for a year, right? Like he was complaining about some of the crap, and I'm like, they do that all the time. He's like, yeah, I don't know how you put up with it. It drives me nuts. He didn't have the temperament for it. Not everybody does, and no amount of like, it wasn't him saying, oh, I can't make up all the villains, and I could say, well, use the enemy's books. He made up all his own villains. They had weird names. I still remember like a cheerful death and a fear of sorts, and Legerdemain. Legerdemain was at least a little normal. I don't know what a cheerful death and a fear of swords were supposed to be. I remember him saying there was some sort of a weird riddle to the name of the villains, and I never was able to figure out what it was. I think he told us, and I was like, "Oh wow, really? I never picked that up." But some of it was that I didn't see all the villains because I was on vacation, right? So that was part of it. But but yeah, he had it like he didn't have any problem making up villains. I don't think he liked making up battle maps, so a lot of his battle maps were just like a blank sheet of paper with maybe a couple of lines on them. Um, and he didn't like doing villain artwork, so his villains didn't have drawings. Whereas I used to like, I wasn't a very good artist, but I still like trying to do it and make some cool villain art. And I didn't have Photoshop or anything like that, or I might have been better at it, but I used to sketch the villains, and it wasn't great art, but I like doing it, making up costumes and stuff. I still love doing that, and like in City of Heroes, making up hero costumes. I mean, now I would like make them up in City of Heroes and take a screenshot, right? Um, but yeah, he did not enjoy the activities that you do as a GM, and he didn't like running the game for the players. He didn't like making rulings and all that stuff. He thought he would enjoy it, and he didn't. And so um, it doesn't matter how easy Steve Peterson and George McDonald make champions for this friend of mine, because he just didn't like the activities that you do as a game master. And so I think that the author of this article is wrong, and I'm surprised that someone who supposedly knows the history of role playing games and D&D would make this statement, because they should realize that not everyone's cut out to be a game master, and that because not everyone is cut out to do it, it doesn't matter how easy you make it, right? It's like saying, well, we'll make it really easy to become a player in the NBA. Yeah, but not everybody is, tall enough. I'm certainly not to be good at basketball, and not everybody has the hand-eye coordination to be good at basketball, right? And so it doesn't matter if you make it easy to get into it. You still are going to have people who just can't do it. And I think the same is true for running games. Um, so yes, I think his point about um, you can't just make stuff for players. You've got to make stuff for GMs and makes their lives easier is correct. Yes, I think that having more DMs would help, but I think there's an upper limit. There's some percentage of the population, and it is not a majority. It's a very small minority. I don't think it's the 1 in 30, but it's probably about 1 in 5 that's the percent of people who just have the personality and temperament to make a GM, and the rest of us don't. And then there's a whole bunch of people who have the temperament and don't have time, right? Like the girl in Finland in our group. She loves DMing, and she's got the temperament for it. It's very clear. Just as a player, because she's the DM's best friend as a player, it's very clear she'd make an amazing game master. Maybe the best I've ever seen. She would be fantastic. She's an incredibly good player. Um, but it's she's got a little girl, and they just moved to a new country, and she's learning a new language, and she's got a job, and she doesn't have time, right? So you have like maybe only 20 or 25% of humanity has the personal temperament, right, on the Myers-Briggs scale or whatever you want to do, that would even make them a good GM in the first place. The willingness to work, the attention to detail, the self-sacrificing nature of it, the ability to manage a table, all those things. Many of them cannot be taught. They're just part of your makeup. My guess would be maybe 1/4 of people even have that, and then out of that 25% of humanity that could even make a good game master by temperament, maybe another 25% of them actually have time. So they're like, if you've got 100 million people playing D&D, there aren't going to be 100 million potential game masters, and not even 20 million, maybe 2 million, right? Because the rest of the people either don't have time or just don't have the temperament to run a game, or they would hate it. Like the one friend of mine who wasn't a bad GM, he was okay, but he hated doing it, and he couldn't wait to stop. And you don't want someone who can't wait to stop to run your game. Like his last session, I was like, how are you going to finish the last session? Like the next session is the end. it seemed like we were like a quarter of the way through the story. And what happened is we got to like 10 o'clock at night, and he was so fed up. He just rushed the ending. There was a portal. His universe started crumbling around them. Everybody had to jump through the portal, and he's like, "Okay, Scrapper, you take over now." And I was like, "Wow, that was a really crappy ending." Like it wasn't. It was done in a rush because he didn't want to do it anymore, right? He didn't put that love and care into it that he was doing at the beginning before I went on vacation. But he was so fed up with it at that point and so unhappy that he just wanted to stop, right? And so that sort of person is in the mix of players. He played Champions for 3 or 4 years. He played D&D with us. He thought he would like GMing, tried it once, said I never want to do it again, right? And so what I disagree with is that if they just make the GM's job easier, there will be millions more GMs. I don't think so. There might be a bunch of people willing to try it, but my guess is they're going to find out it takes too long and they don't have time, or they just don't like doing it. Or they might like it and have time, but be terrible at it because they're selfish, like the bad Rob. And he had plenty of time to run Champions games for us. He probably would have run a lot more if we would have let him. But like after we played in a few scenarios, he only ran 3 or 4 scenarios. Like nobody wanted to play in a scenario with him anymore. He was a terrible GM, right? So we kept finding excuses why it wasn't his turn next. We would switch groups or something so it's not his turn for that other group because nobody wanted him to run. You don't want that, right? That's not the kind of game master we want to recruit. So, yeah, I don't think Wizards can become a billion-dollar company by appealing to GMs because I just don't think there are enough people who are able, willing, and ready to do it. And it doesn't matter how easy they make it, right? People who love GMing and have the temperament of a GM, they're already GMing because if Wizards makes it hard, they fight through, right? Like I said, Coffin Rock was written like an old school adventure, and was I had it took me hours and hours to prep it. I just fought my way through it until I had it ready to go, right? I didn't give up because it was too hard, because somebody whose temperament is to be a good GM, and whose temperament is that makes them a good GM, they're willing to do the work. So saying, well, make it less work and you'll get more DMs. What are you going to get, lazy DMs? And I know there's that lazy dungeon master book, oh, here's how to be a GM without putting too much work into it. And I'm not saying you have to be a slave and put in huge, huge amounts of work. But what I'm saying is, if someone has the temperament and the desire and the time to be a game master, the fact that like Out of the Abyss wasn't well written would not put them off of GMing. It simply won't. If you have the temperament to do it and you have a love for it, you're going to do it anyway. That doesn't mean there couldn't be easier stuff, and maybe a few sort of GMs who aren't quite that ready to do that much work might be appealed to by those sorts of easier, more organized adventures. But I don't think you're going to get a lot, because I think it's a frame of mind and a mindset and a temperament, and people who have that temperament will do it. You can attract more game masters by attracting more people to the hobby because some percentage of them will have the temperament. And I think that's really the way to go. Get more people into D&D playing it, and you can maybe get more DMs. And they have this catch-22. Well, if you don't have enough DMs, how do you get more players? And I don't know the answer to that. Right? I know it's not to make a virtual tabletop that works like Neverwinter Nights that you can play without a DM, because that just turns it into a video game. That's not going to make anyone who plays it that way want to DM. It's going to make them want to keep playing, right? And if you turn DMing into coding and scripting like you do in Neverwinter Nights, there was not that many people writing Neverwinter Nights modules. Why? Because you had to both be a DM in the mindset and be willing to script and code, which I was, because I was already doing that for work. But not everybody is, right? It's only a tiny subset of people that are going to want to do scripting and coding and asset making and all of that stuff. So I don't really know what the solution is, but I'm pretty sure the solution in that letter, which is to just make the GM's life easier, is probably not going to do that much, because it's not going to change people's temperament, and that's what makes you a good GM. I think we'll stop there. We now have the station about halfway clean. We still got to do the ceiling up here, and then we got to do those walls. But we've got the middle done, and we've got that side done. And until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Scrapper Lock Rants with Power Wash Simulator.